Hello, this is Robert Miller. We're continuing our discussion about the regression equation. So this is part 3 on the regression equation. So what I hope that you have taken from our previous discussions about the regression equation is that before we do anything else with regression, we are seeking to explain phenomena. And in this example, we're seeking to explain in terms of persons' personalities. You remember from the second discussion, a regression equation part 2, we talked about how these were different personality factors. So openness to experience, conscientiousness, and emotional stability. We're seeking to understand job engagement in terms of persons' personalities, and higher and lower levels of job engagement in terms of persons' personalities. And so regression is basically, before it can be anything else, before it can be a predictive tool or anything else, it has to start out by being good at explaining phenomena in terms of the predictor variables in the model. All right. So one thing I want to point out then about the regression coefficient for each of the predictor variables in the model. So here's the regression coefficient for the first predictor variable in the model, regression coefficient for the second predictor variable in the model, regression coefficient for the third predictor variable in the model, is that in this model, each of these regression coefficients are called unstandardized regression coefficients. And that's in contrast to a standardized regression coefficient, which we'll talk about at some later point. But these are unstandardized regression coefficients. And if you're ever wondering, this is just a tip for you, if you're ever wondering during a presentation when someone has the regression equation up on the board, whether the regression coefficients are unstandardized regression coefficients or standardized regression coefficients, how you can tell is just to look at whether the constant is present in the regression model. If the constant is present, then the regression coefficients are unstandardized regression coefficients. And if there's no constant in the regression model, then the regression coefficients are standardized regression coefficients. So just a little tip for you. I've seen people looking at regression equations at conferences, and it's not always said whether those regression coefficients are unstandardized or standardized regression coefficients. And someone inevitably raises their hand and asks, well, you won't be doing that because you're going to look at the regression equation, see if the constant is present in the regression model or not, and then you'll know whether those regression coefficients are unstandardized or standardized. All right. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to do something to just kind of get your feet wet in a certain idea. Okay? So if you're not like, totally all about this idea, by the time I'm through describing it for right now, that's okay because I'm going to be returning to it, all right? Because this is real fundamental in terms of its importance. It's of fundamental importance, but it may take a few discussions for you to really feel comfortable with it. So we'll just take it a step at a time. Okay, so here, let me put this up. It's a grid. Let's say that this represents a data set from a statistical analysis. A data set from a statistical procedure like SPSS or STATA or something like that. Okay. All right. So here we have each of your participants in your sample. And we're going to go like this. Give each of them a row. Well, actually, this won't be all of your participants in your sample, right? Because with regression, you're going to have more participants than this. But this is some of them. If you do this long enough, you actually, it's kind of like an aerobic exercise, going back and forth like this. I need to get my exercise wherever I can. So I was kind of enjoying that, back and forth. All right. So here we have participant 1, okay? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Of course, it goes on. You have many participants in your regression sample, your sample for your regression analysis in all likelihood. And then you have a set of variables, each of which has a measure, okay, because we're talking about statistics here, right? So we're not interviewing people. We're not working in terms of words. We're doing statistics. So everything comes down to numbers. And so we have variables that each person, each participant is measured on, and which will ultimately go into our regression analysis when we do that. When we press that OK button and do the regression analysis. But for right now, we're just looking at the data set. All right. Give me a minute here. Oh, now I'm hitting the microphone. I bet people are loving that on the other side here. Well, I hit the microphone, but they just love that. Okay, well anyway, I think that the microphone survived my knocking it like that. Okay, so we have each of our participants, and then we have our variables that we are collecting data on from each of our participants. And one of our variables is our outcome variable. And so let me go over to, I'm going to take a trip here, way over here. I'll be back in a minute. Get the green marker. So here our first variable is job engagement. And again, we have a measure for job engagement, and we're going to get a score for each of our participants on job engagement. But we have additional variables that we collect data on from each participant. So here we have a measure of our first predictor variable, and that's openness to experience. And we're going to get, for each of our participants, a score on openness to experience. That's a subscale on this measure of personality, the 5-factor model we've talked about in previous discussions of the regression equation. And for each participant, we're going to get a score on this subscale of openness to experience, just like we'll also get from each participant a score on job engagement. Okay, well, we have our second predictor variable, conscientiousness. Now that's a long one to spell here in this space, so we'll just do it that way, conscientiousness. And we will also, for participant 1, and for each of our participants here, okay, we're going to get a score on the measure of conscientiousness, that particular subscale of the overall measure of personality. And then we got one more variable here. I didn't need to take it all the way over like this. I only got one more variable. We certainly could have more, but not in this example. And that's our third predictor variable in the model, emotional stability. And we'll just do it this way as ES, emotional stability. So for each participant in our sample, they will receive a stack of measures of 1, 2, 3, 4 measures, and they'll fill out those measures and they'll get a score on each of those measures. And so for participant 1, and of course it depends on the range of scores that's possible for you to get any particular measure. I'm just going to make up some numbers here. For participant 1, their observed score on the job engagement measure, the score they actually got on the job engagement measure, okay, when they filled it out and it was scored by the researcher, might be, let's say it's on a 1 to 10 scale. So 1 is a very low level of job engagement, 5 is a medium level of job engagement, and 10 is a high level of job engagement. Let's say participant 1 got a 6. And so do I want to use green on this? Let me take a look. I'm going to go to red. It requires another trip. I'm taking a trip. I'll be back soon. It won't be long. This is what happens when you have low budget operations. You don't have anybody to bring you anything. So I just go and I get it all myself. All right. So let's say that the participant 1 score, their observed score, the score that they actually got on the job engagement measure, was 6. So we'll put a 6 in here. Now you'll notice something, and this is really, a crucial aspect for you to notice. I'm putting that 6 way over on the side there because you actually are going to get 2 scores on the outcome variable measure. In this case, 2 scores on the job engagement measure for each of your participants. That's the first score, okay? That's the observed score. That's the score that the person actually got on the job engagement measure when they filled it out and it was scored by the researcher. But they're going to get a second score too, but I'm going to keep you in suspense as to what that second score is, that second value on the outcome variable measure. In this case, the job engagement measure. But there's going to be for each participant in your sample a second score on that outcome variable measure. But I'll get that to you later in terms of what that second score is. But for right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go like this, because that way I leave room for what that second score or value is on the outcome variable measure for each of your participants. Now, for participant 1, you'll also get a score on the predictor variable measure for openness to experience. And let's say it's on a 1 to 10 scale. It's just an example. And you have a low score on openness to experience. You're low on openness to experience. You have a high score on openness to experience, something like 8 or 9 or 10. You're high in your openness to experience. Let's say that for participant 1, their score on openness to experience, let's say, is 8. And that same person, participant 1, on the predictor variable measure for conscientiousness, still on a 1 to 10 scale, let's say that they got let's say that participant 1 on that measure of conscientiousness got a score of 4. And let's say that again for participant 1 on the emotional stability measure, that particular factor of personality, again on a 1 to 10 scale, let's say they got a score of 7. Okay. Well, what the regression equation is going to do for each participant in the sample is going to plug these numbers in to each of these spots here where we see each of our predictor variables. So now where it says x sub 1, that'd become an 8. And where it says x sub 2, that'd become a 4. That's for conscientiousness. Where it says x sub 3, that'd become a 7 for emotional stability. And you'll notice now with this being an 8, score of 8, and then we have a regression coefficient for openness to experience, and it is some value. I won't put a value in right now, but it's some value. Well, we take the product of those two, we times those together, and we get some value that represents the product of the person's score on the openness to experience measure times the regression coefficient for that first predictor variable. So we get some product when those two are multiplied together. And the same occurs here for the measure on conscientiousness for participant 1, with their score of 4 on that measure, multiplied by the regression coefficient for our second predictor variable. And then the same occurs here as well for our third predictor variable, emotional stability, here with that score of 7, times the regression coefficient value, whatever that may be, so that product, and the product here plus the product here plus the product here, plus whatever our constant is, that's some value as well, is going to equal that second value, that each participant has on the outcome variable measure, which is the predicted value on the outcome variable measure for each participant, in this case, participant 1, from the model. And this is done for each of your participants. So in that way, this regression equation is applied to each of the participants in your sample. And let's just say, because we don't have some of the values up here, so we can't say exactly, but let's just say that the predicted value for participant 1 on the job engagement measure, the outcome variable measure, is 7. So there are the two values that you have in the outcome variable measure, in this case job engagement, for each of your participants, in this case participant 1. And you'll notice the predicted value, so this is the predicted value, and this is the observed value on the outcome variable measure. The predicted value, based on person's scores on the predictor variable measures, participant 1 scores, the predicted value on the outcome variable measure, in this case, comes quite close to the actual observed score that participant 1 got on the outcome variable measure. So that's a good prediction. It comes very close to the actual observed score that participant 1 got on the outcome variable measure. And this is done for participant 2 and for participant 3 and participant 4. And so let's do this really quickly. Let's say we have some more observed scores on the job engagement measure. We have a 4, and the predicted value coming out of the model, let's say here is 9. Well, that's further off, isn't it, from the actual observed score. And for person 3, they got let's say a value of 3, an actual observed score in the outcome variable measure. That's the actual observed score. Maybe make that a little clearer. OBS, observed score, on the outcome variable measure. The predicted score coming out of the model based on participant 3's scores on the predictor variable measures in the model. The predicted value from the model for participant 3, maybe that's 5. So that's the predicted value in the outcome variable measure for participant 3. And that comes pretty close to the actual observed value on the outcome variable measure. And one more, let's say that participant 4 got an 8, that's their actual observed value on the outcome variable measure, and the predicted value on the outcome variable measure for participant 4 from the model, predicted value from the model, let's say is 6. Well, that's pretty close too to the actual observed value. And if it continued like that, it's a little bit further away. That's pretty close. And this one, look at this. Here the model predicted participant 7 score on the outcome variable measure perfectly, because the predicted value coming out of the model based on participant 7 scores on the predictor variable measures in the model is exactly the same as participant 7 actual observed score on the outcome variable measure. And so the closer overall that these predicted scores for each participant on the outcome variable measure come to the actual observed scores of each participant on the outcome variable measure, then the better of a fit that we say that we have of the model with the data here being our actual observed scores on the outcome variable measure. So we want these predicted values overall to be as close to the actual observed values on the outcome variable measure, and the closer they are, the better of a fit of the model with the data that we say that we have. Okay, that's a beginning part of the discussion about fit and the fit of models with data, but I hope that's helpful and you have a good day.